at different parts of the cliff, but also disparities or inequities in exposures and opportunities. So it's going to be shining the bright light on, is there something going on differential, especially in terms of race or in terms of geography or in terms of gender, looking for these inequities. Then it's going to involve examining structures, policies, practices, norms, and values to figure out how did these things get that way and how are they being perpetuated in that way. And when I talk about structures, I talk about the who, what, when, and where of decision making. So who's at the table and who's not, what's on the agenda and what's not. Policies are the written how of decision making. Practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision making, and values are the why. And when we look at these things, we're going to have to be willing to intervene on societal structures and to pay attention to systems of power. And this sounds so big for a person to do. You know, how can I intervene on systems of power? You know, maybe I should just worry about what I eat. You know, maybe I should just walk more. And yes, you need to worry about those things, but you don't have to intervene on systems of power as individuals. And actually, to the extent that we can come together in collectives, in communities, and develop a sense of collective efficacy, that's the point at which you can actually start looking at policies and pushing for their change or pushing for their enactment. In terms of addressing social determinants and social determinants of health and equity, we need to do both. We need to address the social determinants of health, which include poverty. If we're going to achieve large and sustained improvements in health outcomes, we must move the population away from the edge of the cliff. But we must also address the social determinants of equity, which include racism, if we're going to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. We have to move all of the population away from the edge of the cliff. I'm now going to turn to a more detailed discussion on racism, which we hardly ever talk about in this country, but which is one of those systems of power, which is one of those social determinants of equity, which is a major determinant of whether or not we live in a country with social justice. So before I go to that, are there any questions or comments on what I've said so far? Yes?
You mentioned influences, social influences. You mentioned positive ones. Unfortunately, in some neighborhoods, there's some very negative social influences coming under the headings of violence and drugs.
Yes.
And they are prevalent in certain neighborhoods and not others, it seems. And they certainly would affect one's health.
Absolutely. And so we note that those things are prevalent, but we then have to ask, we always, in all of the things that we observe, we have to ask why. Why are they in some neighborhoods and not others? What are the conditions? Is it, you know, the poor education? Is it poverty, no other job options? What are the conditions that make these things cluster in some neighborhoods versus others? And so that question of why, not just looking at what we see and thinking, oh, it just so happens to be that way, or it will always be that way, and there's nothing we can do about it. But when we observe things that are either good for health or bad for health, we need to ask, why are these things distributed in the way that they are? And keep backing up to try to figure out where we can intervene. Is that, yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, so I'm delighted now to go on and talk more specifically about racism, which is one of the social determinants of equity, which we hardly ever talk about in this country. Why racism? Well, I could tell you a million reasons why we have to talk about it. I just talked about it as one of the things that distributes the population unevenly on our three-dimensional cliff. But even if you're just thinking from a health perspective, if we really intend to eliminate racial disparities in health, we need to examine the fundamental causes of those disparities. And when you think about what the variable race measures, it's just a rough proxy for social class, rougher for culture, meaningless for genes, but it's a precise measure of the social classification of people in our race-conscious society. And if you were doing health research, the same race that a medical admitting clerk might check off for a patient is the same race that a taxi driver notices, or a police officer, or a judge in a courtroom, or a teacher in a classroom. And it's this race that has profound impacts on our life opportunities and our life exposures. And for that reason, I and many other researchers now in this country hypothesize racism as a fundamental cause of racial ethnic health disparities. And if you ever Google, racism in health, or you go to Medline or PubMed and do a search, you will find lots of studies now on this area. So what is racism? Well, when I talk about racism, I start out by saying that it's a system. That is, it's not an individual character flaw. It's not a personal moral failing, and it's not even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, but it's a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race. So here in New Jersey, I am black, but I'm told that in some parts of Brazil, I would be clearly white, and sometimes I actually joke with my husband that that might be a nice vacation spot for me for a few weeks. In South Africa, I'm clearly colored. So with the same appearance in 3 different places, I would be assigned to 3 different racial groups. And if I were to stay in those places long enough, then my health outcome would take on that of the group to which I was assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all 3 places. So now, describing this system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how we look, what is the impact of this system? Well, racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. And when we talk about racism at all in this country, this is usually how we talk about it. But at the same time that it's unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities, it's also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities, which is much less frequently talked about. But that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege. And then as we acknowledge that we have a system now that's either unfairly disadvantaging or reciprocally unfairly advantaging individuals and communities, this system is also sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And what I mean by that is, just take a look at how we don't invest in the full education of all our children, because the blinders of racism have made us not even value all of our children. We don't see genius in the barrios or in the ghettos or on the reservations. And so we don't understand that we are wasting this genius. If we were to invest in the full education of all of our children, how much better we could be doing as a nation or even as a world. We might be farming on Mars or doing whatever would be a good idea if we were to invest in all of that genius. Think about how we are complacent with the warehousing of so many black and brown men in our prisons, not recognizing that is a waste of human resources. Think about how when we hear about the health disparity statistics, which a lot of us aren't even aware of, but when we do understand, we don't cry out at them. We don't understand that when Miss Bess dies 8 years before her time, it's not just a problem for her or her family or her church, but it's a problem for our whole nation because we have lost her for 8 years and what she could contribute to our nation. It's actually quite a challenge, I think, when we talk about racism. First of all, I would love for all of us to go out and start being able to say the word racism easily off of our tongues. But when we do that, people will get the unfair disadvantage right away, but the understanding of the unfair advantage might slow some of our white anti-racist colleagues until they understand that whether or not they as individuals are advantaged by racism, the whole society is being sapped in its strength. And so I actually think that part of our messaging will have to be, and part of our research, if you're a researcher, part of our storytelling, if you're a storyteller, part of our writing, if you're a journalist, is going to be how this system is sapping the strength of our whole society. That was a nice global definition of racism, but how can it really impact health? How can it cause more diabetes, right? I think it's useful to think about the impacts of racism on health on 3 levels: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. This helps us not only figure out how could racism be affecting the asthma rates in our city, but it also gives us some guidance on how to intervene. So I'm going to quickly define each of these levels, provide some examples of how they impact on health, and then illustrate the 3 levels of racism with an allegory, a teaching story. Institutionalized racism, this first level of racism, is the system that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This kind of racism doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. And in fact, it often shows itself as inherited disadvantage. It's institutionalized in our laws and in our structures. And examples include material conditions as well as access to power. So examples of institutionalized racism would be differential access to quality housing or excellent education, or equal employment opportunities, or even equal income at the same level of employment. Differential access to medical facilities or a clean environment. In terms of access to power, differential access to information, which could be health information or even information about our own histories. Differential access to resources, including networking, social networking resources, and differential access to voice, as voice in the media, voice on government. Now, some people have asked me, you have housing, education, employment, income. Didn't you just have a slide a few slides ago that said this was social class? Why is this on a slide now that says racism? Are you talking about social class, or are you talking about racism? And that's a very fundamental question. So I'm going to take a minute to address it by saying it doesn't, to start with, it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That's not just a happenstance. And for each stigmatized group, there's a different history. So for people of African descent, there was the initial historical insult of the kidnapping of West African people. And then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But now some of you all are thinking, oh, there she goes talking about slavery again, right? You know, the enslaved people, they'll say, Dr. Jones, didn't you know the enslaved people were emancipated in 1865? You know, that's 144 years ago. All else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else is still not equal today. And there are still today what I describe as contemporary structural factors that perpetuate that initial historical insult. I'll give you some examples of those in a few minutes. But now when you ask me, am I talking about social class or am I talking about racism, I say institutionalized racism explains the fact that we even see an association between social class and race in this country. And that's a very important thing. It's important to know that as important as it will be to have social class strategies, you know, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could eliminate poverty today? If we were to do that, though, and not deal with the background laws and policies and structures that are differentially distributing people of color into poverty and white folks into wealth, even if we were to eliminate poverty today without addressing those background forces, then 20 years from now, we probably would find that we had started stratifying again by race. So we must acknowledge all of it. Now, institutionalized racism can be through acts of commission, of doing, as well as acts of omission. And very importantly, institutionalized racism is often manifest as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define quickly as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice, the different idea, and the discrimination, the different action. And how could that impact your health? Well, police brutality, to start with. Say you're pulled over for driving while black or driving while Latino, and then you're interpreted as resisting arrest and hit upside the head. That certainly would impact your health. And actually, I don't know if you all have a problem with even sometimes police shootings of people, you know, of unarmed folks. I don't know if there's been a lot of that going around. All over the country there is. Physician disrespect. That can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician feels that that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't understand or wouldn't comply anyway. Or it could be as blatant as sterilization abuse, which we've seen in waves around this country across the decades. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not being served in a restaurant. Teacher devaluation. Those first two, shopper vigilance and waiter indifference, those are parts of the annoyances of everyday racism, which I think results in higher blood pressure and all of that. Teacher devaluation is a very important manifestation of personally mediated racism. When a teacher looks at a young child and thinks that child can't learn, or that child's hyperactive, and they put them off in a special track, which then constrains their opportunities to know their full potential, and is sort of like another generation lost. It's very important. Now, institutionalized racism and personally mediated racism both can be through acts of commission, doing, as well as acts of omission, not doing. But personally mediated racism also can be unintentional, as well as intentional. You don't have to have had a racist idea or intended to be racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism I describe, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. And here I'm clearly talking from the point of view of the stigmatized races. Some of my colleagues have said, well, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that some white people walk around with? And that's clearly internalized racism too, but that goes, I fold that into my institutionalized. So from the point of view of stigmatized races, this internalized racism can impact our health through self-devaluation, feeling like you're really not as good as. Maybe you shouldn't apply to college or try to go to medical or nursing school or live in that neighborhood. I think that self-devaluation also turns into fratricide, black on black or Latino on Latino crime. Because if you don't value yourself, then you won't value others who look like you, and you'd be just as, it would be just as easy for you to off them as not. The white man's ice is colder syndrome, that phraseology comes from my parents' generation, and what it meant then and still means today is, say that you are black or Latino, and you want a doctor. You may go look for a white doctor instead of a black doctor or a Latino doctor. Say you need a lawyer, you go and look for a white lawyer instead of a black lawyer. In fact, if your drink was warm, you might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder. It's deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, I think these turn into self-destructive health behaviors. And basically, internalized racism is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that a young child interested in music might, if she's black, if she's my daughter, might say, well, I won't play the violin because violin is not a black instrument. Or, Latino high school students, one teasing another one who's trying to excel, saying, oh, so-and-so is just trying to be white. And since when did white folks claim exclusive access to excellence? So now I'm going to animate these three levels of racism, institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized racism by sharing with you a teaching story. Now, I have a lot of teaching stories, and they all are sparked by something that I have seen in my own real life. So I'll describe what I saw with my own eyes first, and then we'll make it a story about racism. So when I went to Hopkins to do my PhD, my husband and I bought our first freestanding house, and we were all happy. And we, the house had a beautiful wraparound porch with flower boxes on it. So we bought the house in October, so we couldn't really plant anything in the winter, but when spring came, we were all excited. So we run out, we're going to fill our flower boxes with flowers. And we noticed that some of the boxes have dirt in them already, and some of the boxes are empty. So my husband, very dutifully, goes off to the gardening store, and he comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil, and he fills up the boxes with dirt. And we take our marigold seeds, and we put equal numbers of seeds in all of the boxes, and we water the boxes. And I am not the gardener in our family, so I just sort of sit back to see what's going to happen. And about 3 weeks later, I'm walking out onto my porch, and I stopped because I was like, oh my goodness. It looked to me like we had planted two different species because some of the flower boxes were full, lots of plants, first of all, and the plants were tall and vigorous. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and meager looking. And then I realized what had happened. The potting soil was rich, fertile soil, and every single seed planted into that soil had sprouted. And the strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it up to a middling height. But the old soil that we had found there was poor, rocky soil, and the weak seed planted in that poor, rocky soil had died. And even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil was just struggling to make it to a middling height. And I saw this with my own eyes, and if you are gardeners and you compost half of your garden, whatever, you've seen this with your own eyes, and it's an image that's about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now we're going to take this image and we're going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have poor rocky soil and one which she knows to have rich fertile soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And this gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. She takes the pink seed and she puts it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. Every single red seed has sprouted. The strong is tall and vigorous, but even the weak red seed has made it to a middling height. But in the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And here comes the strong pink seed, just trying to make it. And then those flowers go to seed. And then the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens. Until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes. And she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story for a minute to say this first part is about how institutionalized racism works. You had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate. And then through inaction in the face of need, the gardener just perpetuating this inequity. But now let's go back to the story and say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, here, you know, the gardener's looking at red, loving red. And she looks over at pink. She says, oh, those flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off a pink blossom before it can even go to seed. Or she might notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. Where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are flourishing in their enriched soil, probably many of them, or maybe most of them, or maybe all of them not understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. But the pink flowers are over here looking at red, trying to make it, and the bees are just minding their own business, collecting nectar, but they're pollinating in the meantime. So here comes a bee, you know, bzzz, goes into one flower, bzzz, is over here in the pink flowers here. Bzzz, comes over to this other pink flower, and the pink flower says, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of the pink pollen. I prefer the red. Because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, let's start out by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that's good, but if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. Or you could say, well, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with that gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is also very good. So we're going to have a workshop for the gardener. And in this workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will. Maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. What we really need to do if we want to set things right in this garden is address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep the boxes separate, well, I guess that's okay too, although it makes it easier to segregate resources going forward. But if we do that, then we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They will be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. Maybe even a little better than the red, because they've been selected for survival and strength over the generations, which is an interesting notion. But now that you've addressed the institutionalized racism, you will have also addressed the internalized racism. Because pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking that red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink. But her children growing up and seeing the boxes equally beautiful would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. Good if you can address all the levels at the same time. But we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. And when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. Now, there's a very important question that I haven't addressed yet in this story, and that is, who is the gardener, right? Because the gardener is the one that I have painted as the one with the power to decide, the power to act or agency, and the control of resources. These three things are the elements, I think, of self-determination. And clearly, government is part of this gardener. On my slide, I used to have a big government You know, now I'm part of government. I sort of took that out. But I became part of government because government is part of the gardener, as are, you know, rich people behind government. And maybe to the extent that we can have self-determination in our communities, we can become part of the gardener. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. When she can look at her boxes looking like that and think that her garden is okay or even beautiful, because she's not really counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. The challenge for us is what to do about this gardener. You know, do we need to make the gardener polka dotted or striped or fuchsia, or do we need, you know, will pink have to grow or recruit their own gardener? There are a lot of interesting issues that can come out of this story. And I actually commend this story to you all if you want to start conversations about racism. I hope that we'll have a conversation based on this story in a minute in this room. But it's something that it's easy for people to say. I'll raise one question for you before I carry on. One question I often get asked. Why should, say we don't have extra fertilizer, why would the red flowers, why should they share their soil with the pink flowers, right? And so I have an answer for that. I mean, you can think about it. But my answer for that, and I'm sure we'll have lots of discussion about this, is it was never their soil. This is the soil of the gardener. I mean, of the whole garden. It is the garden soil. And even though it might feel a little hurtful for that sharing to go on, actually the whole garden will be a lot more beautiful. And maybe there'll be more opportunity. Maybe there'll be opportunity for different kinds of flowers or, you know, more beauty. So anyway, we'll have a lot of these kinds of questions. I want to carry on, though, because I have just a little bit more to say. It's all well and good for me to tell you stories about racism. It's even well and good for us to measure racism, as we have in many studies. We actually have a 6-question reactions to race module on a telephone survey that is available to all the states to do in cooperative agreement with CDC. But even if we document that racism exists, yes, and that it's having detrimental impacts on health, which it does, and I'd love, if you ask me a question, I'll tell you about one of those studies. What are we going to do about it is the most important question. So if institutionalized racism is where we're going to focus ourselves, first we need to scan for the evidence of racial disparities. We need to look at outcomes by race and, you know, ask the question, could racism be operating here? But more importantly, we need to identify the mechanisms of racism, asking the question, how is racism operating here? And when we do that, as I mentioned before, we'll need to be examining structures, who, what, when, and where of decision making, policies, the written how, practices and norms, the unwritten how, and values, which I haven't even added to my slide, but that's a very important piece. When we go back to the cliff analogy, the value set up the whole situation. The gardener's initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation. And we might enrich all the soil, make it equally enriched, but if the gardener continues to prefer red over pink, then going forward, she will still continue to favor red. So the values piece is something that we need to deal with. Now at CDC, we have started thinking about policies, like 4 classes of policies that we could look at. We've also started thinking about how do you look at structures? How do you know, so we're trying to start thinking about how do you do analysis that can be useful for action on these structural things which seem too big. Well, in terms of the policies of interest, 4 classes we've identified, and I'm sure there are many others, but policies that allow the segregation of resources and risks by race. Policies that create inherited group disadvantage or inherited group advantage. Policies that favor the differential valuation of human life by race. And policies that limit self-determination. So I'm going to quickly give you examples of each of these. In terms of policies that allow the segregation of resources and risks, they include